We are live. All right. Hello to everybody. My name is Alexander Beresko. I am the president of Eurodoc, the European Council of Doctoral Candidates and Junior Researchers. Today is the first day of International Open Access Week, and which is an annual opportunity for the academic and research community to continue learning about the potential benefits of open access, to share what they've learned with colleagues, and to help inspire wider participation in helping to make open access and open science a new norm in scholarship and research. The recent progress in open science particularly focuses on peer review, a critical scholarly practice aimed at assessing the validity, quality, and often the originality of research outputs. Recently, peer review has become an object of experiments, especially regarding introducing more openness to the process, such as publishing review reports and revealing reviewers' names. For instance, a very open peer reviewing style is practiced at Open Research Europe, an innovative open access publishing platform of the European Commission. Also, peer review is recognized as central for qualitative research evaluation in the recent agreement on reforming research assessment, which is likely to reshape the rules for evaluating research in Europe and beyond. Hence, we need a better understanding of the review process and its features. That is why we organized this webinar and invited top experts in the field to discuss the topic with them. Before introducing our speakers, let me say a few words about Eurodoc. Julia, could you please allow me to share my screen? Yes, I hope you can see it now. We are a non-profit organization and the grassroots federation of national associations of early career researchers in Europe. Eurodoc was established in 2002 and is based in Brussels. As representatives of doctoral candidates and junior researchers at European level, we engage with all major stakeholders in research and innovation in Europe. The main topics of early career researchers that we identified are career development, especially for non-academic labor market, the rise of open science. Early career researchers need to understand what it is and how it can be implemented, and the rise in mental health issues that we are seeing in academia, especially among doctoral candidates and postdoctoral researchers. Eurodoc currently has 26 national organizations from 24 countries that are associations representing early career researchers at the national level. Eurodoc is committed to open access and open science. In recent years, we contributed to policy development in this direction, organized numerous events, and are taking part in relevant European Union-funded projects such as Optima and Opus. All right, let me finally introduce our speakers. Silvia Gomez-Recio is the first Secretary General of the Young European Research University Network, ERUN, since October 2016, when the network opened its Brussels office. She is responsible for the strategic leadership, networking actions, and the implementation of the network strategy. ERUN is a network of like-minded young research universities in Europe that strengthens and facilitates cooperation in areas of research, education, and services to society. Currently, ERUN includes 22 member universities. Serge Horbach works as a postdoctoral fellow in science and technology studies at the Danish Center for Studies in Research and Research Policy, Aarhus University. Being trained as a mathematician, he currently works in STS and sociology of science. His main research interests include scholarly communication, research evaluation, and science's quality assurance mechanisms, with a particular focus on research integrity and journal peer review. He currently coordinates the Horizon Europe POIESIS project, studying how public trust in science is affected by matters of research integrity and open science. Veronique Kiermer is a Chief Scientific Officer at PLOS, the Public Library of Science, where she oversees the editorial department and the development of services, products, and policies to promote open science. Before joining PLOS in 2015, she was executive editor and director of author and reviewer services for Nature Publishing Group, where she managed editorial and research integrity policies across the Nature journals. She is a champion of ORCID and an alumni of its board of directors. Since 2021, she is a member of the United States National Academy of Sciences Strategic Council for Research Excellence, Integrity, and Trust. Tony Rosheller is leader of the Open and Reproducible Research Group at Graz University of Technology and Know Center in Graz, Austria. With a background in information science and philosophy, his research focuses on a range of issues related to open science evaluation, skills, policy, governance, monitoring, and infrastructure. Charlotte Wien is a full professor of scholarly communication at the University of Southern Denmark and highly active in the open science movement. And as such, member of Spark Europe's executive board. Her area of research interest is the consequences of using bibliometric measures to assess research quality and incentives created by the new public management regime in academia. And last, but definitely not the least, Kelly Woods is a senior associate publisher at F1000, where she manages and develops the Open Research Europe publishing platform, working collaboratively with members of the European Commission and other partners, Eurodoc, Liber, and the Global Young Academy. She has a background in open access publishing and is an active promoter of F1000 open research model on the international stage. On this photo, she is with her lovely pet Dougie. All right. Dear all, we will organize our webinar as a 3-round discussion. I will ask the panelists to deliver about 3-minute messages during rounds, and I will pass the audience's questions to them after each round. So I hope you're ready for the discussion. As our first, let's say, discussion point is various types of peer review, blind, open, and everything in between, and how they are and should be implemented. Indeed, at the moment, there are many ways of how we can implement the scholarly practice, and we would like to know what you think about them and which way we should go. Our first speaker will be Silvia Gomez. Silvia, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, but mainly for inviting us to be part of this. And thank you for having organized it, and yourself also personally, but also Eurodoc as an organization promoting open science at all levels. We've been collaborating with Eurodoc in different activities, so happy to contribute to this as well. I'm coming today, you put us as the experts on peer review. I will get a disclaimer already. I'm not the expert on peer review, but I'm happy to bring a little bit the reflection that we had while preparing for this event, and is that we've seen that the role of peer review is considered crucial in the various processes of research assessment within our institutions, in the processes of our own researchers within our institutions, in academic recruitment and in promotion, in funding processes of project funding, when selecting individuals for PhD programs, but also in the academic journal publishing. But to me, that I'm not an expert on it, and it was also, I had to kind of dig a little bit in between the various different types of peer review that it has, and that there is, and that there are. I see that there is one that maybe is more dominant than the others, and is maybe more the traditional blind peer review. And maybe that's one of the key things that we will need also to see why we have that kind of peer review system dominating more than others, and what are maybe the benefits of some of them compared to the others. But one reflection that I had when preparing some notes for this question is that we already have it. So peer review is there. But that peer review system, and there are different models, but how we are implementing these models has also led us to have some systems in which our own researchers have to back up themselves to use some quantitative indicators to back up their decisions when they were using also peer review, but to make sure that they were managing some processes that were otherwise a little bit unmanageable. So it's something that we are now putting a lot of effort on, especially consider to the second question that we will have today in the reform of research assessment. It's like the whole attention is put on that, but the system is there. So why we were not already using it at its full potential? Maybe that's something that I would be very happy to hear from other colleagues as well. And because I'm not the expert on peer review, I will let the others use the 3 minutes more than me. So I give a short intervention first.
Many thanks, Silvia. And let me invite Serge to continue.
Thank you, Alexander, and thanks indeed for organizing this and for so very kindly and nicely introducing us all. Regarding this first question, I think it's very important indeed to acknowledge the very, very wide variety of different peer review models that exist. And well, as you briefly pointed out in the introduction, my background and my focus in research has mainly been on journal peer review systems. So peer review in the context of scholarly communication. And I think then in your question, you point out blind review, open review. But I think there's variety in peer review formats in many more dimensions. The timing of peer review can differ with registered reports and review of them, review of full manuscripts, post-publication peer review. And we increasingly see many different initiatives along these sets emerging in various different contexts. Though I think inertia in the system is quite high, and indeed we have several traditional ways of doing this, which tend to be somewhat discipline specific, especially with regard to this blinding aspect, where the social sciences and the natural medical sciences clearly have their own different paths and traditional ways of organizing this. Though I very much like the fact that all of this experimentation is currently going on, despite the fact that we currently have very little evidence and very little knowledge about the actual effects, merits, drawbacks of the different systems. So there's really a lot of stuff to be gained and stuff to be learned there. So among all this experimentation, I would really like to see a lot of evaluation of these different models going on as well, because we're really going to need that if we're going to explore these different models on scale and try to implement them in different contexts, including also ones beyond scholarly publication and in grant review or other kinds of review or assessment. So I think I'll leave it at that and hope to engage in many more discussions here today.
Thanks, Sage. Thanks a lot. And let me invite our next speaker who joined us overseas. So that's Veronique Kirmer, please.
Hi, thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me. I don't particularly feel that I'm an expert in peer review either, but I guess what I can share a little bit is our experience at PLOS with trying to open the peer review system. We were not at all by far the pioneers in there. There are other people on this call who had done this before us. But I think one of the things that was particularly challenging for PLOS when we started to open the peer review system about 3 years ago was the scale and the diversity, and this speaks to some of the other speakers have said. There is really a lot of sort of discipline specific norms and preferences, and there is very little evidence on the impact of different systems. And so the approach that we took when considering that was really to promote to start from transparency, thinking that transparency was important for accountability, and there is some evidence of that actually reviewers' accountability is increased with more transparency. but also for the accountability of the journals, in the sense that for me, having the peer review process being more open is a sign from the journal of being accountable to the readers, so that as a reader, you can actually scrutinize what has been looked at and what has not been looked at during peer review, because peer review is an imperfect system. I think that's something we need to acknowledge, and so I think that having that transparency is helpful for that. And the other very important aspect of transparency is that it allows for credit as well for review. You know, peer reviewing is a very important activity. It takes time, it takes skills, and it all happens behind the scenes mostly still. And so I think that opening it up is the first step towards giving more credit for that. So these were the motivations, and so the way we've decided to do that is that we publish alongside a published article the whole package that includes all the peer reviewer reports, the editorial decision letters, and so how the editors have actually interpreted and acted upon the reviewer reports, as well as the responses from the authors, so that there is a chance for the authors to rebut criticism that they feel unfair, etc. And we've made the system actually opt-in for authors at the time of publication. So, and this was really done in the sense that we didn't want to impose this on, and we wanted to understand more what the impact of this could have on different fields. It's been going on for about 3 years. We have about 40% opt-in across the board, all discipline confused, and there is a lot of discipline variability and journal by journal variability. So, and the other thing I just want to say as well is that there is quite there is about 18,000 peer review manuscripts with peer review available out there, and that's substrate for research as well. So I would just invite people who are interested in that to study our system. And I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Veronique. Our next speaker is Tony Rothheller. Please, Tony.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks to Eurodoc and Alexander for the invitation. So just to back up this idea of different contexts and different disciplines. So open peer review kind of experiments with that began a long time ago, like 25 years ago now in medicine, and they're kind of a lot more receptive to this. Social sciences and humanities have a lot more of a tradition, and kind of double blind is seen as a gold standard very often there. I've been an advocate of open peer review, or of some forms of open peer review, at least for a long time, but especially in the Eurodoc context, we shouldn't forget that the point of blinding, double blinding, is to protect the author. There was a study which came out in the last few weeks, which was published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, called Nobel or Novice, and it had this paper which was co-authored by a Nobel Prize winner and kind of a postdoc who wasn't so well known. They sent it out to all these different reviewers, but either put the Nobel's name or the novice's name, and they found this huge effect in people wanted to review more if they thought it was the Nobel, and they gave it higher scores. Like it was like 2% acceptance versus 20%. There are some methodological issues, I think, with that study, but the point being the status effects are real. They are real, and these are things which would work against Eurodoc members, because by their nature, early career researchers starting out, the novices. Okay, so this was the idea of double blind. I don't think that double blind is the answer, because I don't think it works quite a lot of the time. Studies usually show that people can tell between like 20 and 45% of the time. But we also have to bear in mind the other things that we're trying to change about the system of scholarly communication. And for me, the primary thing to change about the peer review system is it takes so long, and that work is tied up in knots that are not seen for 6 months, a year, 2 years, if it goes under a double blind system, because you can't have pre-printing. With preprinting, you just have to do a Google search and you'll find it. So we have to prioritize what we think is most important. For me, just the fact that preprints are kind of a no-brainer. I think that COVID has shown the worth of preprints and dispelled a lot of doubts about the dangers. And so with that in mind, I would prefer kind of a more open system, just for that reason. If double-blind doesn't really work and it's not really the answer, and it would block other innovations, then moving towards more transparency, bringing any biases out into the open and making them visible is the answer that I would promote. Michelle.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, and let me invite Charlotte Wien to continue.
Well, thank you. And also from me, thank you for the invitation. Oh, this is getting exciting. I think we are sort of like having a sparkling discussion, or going to have a sparkling discussion here, because in my point of view, we should abandon the blindness of peer review as soon as possible. We should open it up and we should ensure the transparency of research assessment that is sort of like within the spirit of research itself. I never understood why all processes of scientific work should be transparent. And then the key one, the one that decides whether it goes on for publication or not, is blinded. And I was pretty surprised to hear you, Tony, say that it was because we wanted to protect the author. I'm not sure about that, because I mean, if we want to protect somebody, we need to protect somebody against somebody's lack of professionalism, right? So the blindness is actually a protection against lack of professionalism, because if researchers, if they know that it's a Nobel Prize winner, then they will sort of give a good peer review. If that's the truth, then researchers doing peer review are unprofessional. Right. So this protection of the author is a little bit, I think, a little bit weird. And if it's not a protection of the author, but a protection of the peer reviewer, the problem is again the same. Because if you want to protect the peer reviewer, it must be because the peer reviewer are assumed not to be professional. So all of this blindness in the peer review process must be founded in some assumption that researchers are not professional enough to do this in the open. And as you can probably tell from the color of my hair, I've been around for some years in this business. I've been peer reviewed many times. I've been peer reviewed for change of position, for tenure track, for promotion, and I've been peer reviewed with my articles and stuff. And I've had a lot of experience with lack of professionalism among peer reviewers. Some of the peer review reports I have received are horrendous. People who don't know anything or don't understand anything, or are not willing to do it, or don't spend time enough doing it, so that they give me a lousy peer review on something they didn't understand, or because they were not professional enough to do it, because they were never trained, or because they don't have the expertise within the area, and they can hide behind the anonymity. And as far as I know, and those of you working in the publishing business can probably say whether I'm right or not, but as far as I know, it's getting increasingly difficult to find qualified peer reviewers for journal peer reviewing. And I would think that it's the same for funding peer reviewing, and it's the same for all kinds of peer review, because it's time consuming, and due to the blindness, it doesn't give you any merit on your researcher CV. So if you are sort of like on the main track for your next promotion, then you can't spend time doing peer review. So the professional or the good peer reviewers step away from doing peer review because of the blindness. So in my point of view, we cannot abandon the blindness fast enough. And I'll leave it with that.
Many thanks, Charlotte. That was an interesting point. And let me invite Kelly Woods. Please, Kelly.
Hey, thanks, Oleg, again for the invitation. And yeah, as Charlotte said, I'm already excited for where the discussion is going. So I'm glad to be part of it. Sorry, that was my dog just making his entrance to the webinar. Excellent. So I work at F1000, and they've kind of introduced, well, open peer review and open publishing from the very beginning of the company. Really, it's one of the core fundamental values of F1000. So we do mandate that all of the papers that are submitted are undergo an open peer review process, and it's kind of central to our model as well, given that it's a post-publication model of peer review. So the papers are submitted, they undergo a series of pre-publication checks by our in-house editorial team to just make sure that there's nothing too scary going on there that we don't want to put up on the site before we post it, almost as a preprint. And at that point, the peer reviewers are invited and are asked to submit their peer review reports. Once those come in, they are published alongside the article as well. They're named and they're connected to their ORCID account as well, just to try and give a little bit more credit, as we've all been talking about, for the reviewers' work that they're doing. And all of those review reports do have their own DOIs as well, so they can be fully citable separately, which is an interesting aspect. I'm not sure how much it's used. I think I would like to start seeing it used much more, but it's there, they can do it. We also keep all the previous versions of the article. So if the authors come back, make a revision, they as well can submit an author response to respond to the reviewer's criticisms or constructive feedback point by point if they wish to, where they've chosen to make amendments, where they perhaps haven't chosen to make amendments because they've disagreed with anything that the reviewer has said. And you can see that in their response and also in the updated version of the article, but the previous versions all do remain there as well. So a very fully open model. We also don't have editors, so that's another little quirk of the F1000 model. But I think, yeah, really pushing to try to open this process up, to give accountability for those reports, to make them a little bit more constructive possibly, and review the articles with the aim to improve that article, and not just to say, no, this article cannot be here. Every article has had money poured into it essentially, and we should work to improve it and hopefully get it to a point where it could reach our threshold for having passed peer review. And it's at that point that our content would then be sent to further indexes to be made more discoverable. So yeah, loving everything that everyone's saying, and really keen to see where this conversation goes.
Thank you, Kelly. So we have several questions regarding, let's say, the first part of our discussion. So today we have already mentioned the discipline-specific aspect. So are there some, let's say, more open disciplines or more closed disciplines? And how should we work with them? Should we provide something unifying or respect this styles a little more? What are your thoughts on this? Charlotte, please.
I don't think we should try to affect the publication patterns of researchers in general. I think researchers within the various disciplines know very well what they're doing and what serves sort of like the community, the disciplinary community. Abandoning blind peer review does not necessarily interfere with the disciplinary aspect, but I think we should stay away from trying to push researchers into behaving different than what they themselves find is the most rational way of working within their discipline.
Thanks. Kelly was next. Please, Kelly.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because obviously Open Research Europe is a multidisciplinary platform. So we cover all areas that the European Commission funds, so pretty much everything. And we kind of had expectations that it would be more popular as a platform within the biological sciences and less popular perhaps within the social sciences and humanities, because they're maybe less familiar with this model of peer review. However, we have actually seen that the platform has been a lot more successful within the social sciences and the humanities than we first anticipated, and we've had a bit slower uptake in the medical and health community and the life sciences community, with the biggest feedback we've been getting there that we don't have indexation in PubMed yet. When are we going to get that? So there's more issues at play here than just the model of peer review, but that seemed to be more of an issue for the medical and health sciences field rather than the social scientists, who are quite excited by the prospect of having a platform where they could publish in this way at no cost to the author. So yeah, just to throw another couple of issues in the ring there. That was our experience from the first sort of year or so of ORE.
Many thanks, Kelly. Please, Serge.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting to hear that, Kelly. And I just wonder whether that might be due to the fact that your platform might be very innovative in the social sciences and humanities, and people from there just really don't have many alternatives if they would like such a system where there are plenty of alternatives for people in the medical science and etc. But that might be just some speculation. And just briefly coming back on the point that Charlotte made before about doing away with the double-blind review, and partly because, well, there's no need to protect the reviewer, as you mentioned, because that would be only because reviewers are acting unprofessionally. Might slightly disagree with that, because, and then also, especially regarding early career researchers, there is this concern, at least for early career researchers or others in less favorable positions, that if you deliver some very critical review of a more established researcher, then that might backfire at some point. So in that sense, double-blind might be a way of protecting the reviewer, allowing him or her to be as critical and as frank as needed. And that just then brings me to the final point, and some of this variation in peer review might be discipline specific, but I think it's also especially a matter of the size of the community in which it is implemented, where especially small, tightly knit communities might be, well, have more difficulties or problems with very open forms of peer review, and might traditionally and for good reasons also be more keen to use some forms of blinding.
Thanks, Serge. And we have a request from Veronique to comment. Please, Veronique.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of social, I mean, I would agree with what Serge was just saying. I think there is a lot of sort of social elements to that. I mean, as Tony was mentioning, the experiments with open peer review started in the medical field, and we see actually in the variety, we don't have much data on social sciences, but like between life sciences and medical sciences, for example, there is more tendency to sign reviews and to opt in to publishing the peer review reports in the medical disciplines. But I think we also see that in some disciplines where the communities have already adopted a lot of open practices. I'm thinking computational biology, genetics. These are fields where being more open and sharing is already much more of a norm, and I think that we see better adoption in these areas as well. And just saying on the identity of reviewers, the position we've taken is that we allow reviewers to sign or not sign their review and remain anonymous if they want, just to respect these cases where there are power dynamics that we don't fully understand, and we are aware that there are biases in the system, and so we want to allow protection to those who want it.
Thanks, Veronique. Charlotte, please. You're muted.
Yeah, I know. In principle, Serge, I agree with you, but the kind of behavior you're describing, that is my point, is unprofessional. I mean, if you get back at somebody because you got a bad peer review, then you are not a professional. If the peer review was done professionally and you as a senior professor gets back at a younger colleague because of a peer review, then you are not professional yourself. So I do see why you sort of think that I sort of cut the chain, but what I really want to say is that we need to ensure that peer review is done professionally. And I think that taking away the chances of hiding behind the anonymity will be one step forward in terms of professionalizing peer review. Because if we take away the anonymity, then everybody can see what's out there and you can see it in the open. I'm being asked to do peer review within stuff like astrophysics. I have my background is in humanities. I know absolutely nothing about astrophysics, but since I've been writing a few papers with a guy who's an astrophysics, then I receive invitations to do peer review on astrophysics. I mean, that's completely madness, and the anonymity enables that kind of madness. So if we want to use peer review more, we need to professionalize it. We need to be sure what is actually going on out there. So that is my point. And my point would be that the blindness in the ideal world, yes, it's because we want to protect people. But what is happening where we are now is that we are protecting unprofessional people, I think.
Many thanks, Charlotte. Okay, Tony, please.
So I sympathize 100% with what you're saying, Charlotte, and I wish we lived in that world. But I don't think we do. Well, first of all, like the kinds of biases that we as people just carry, it's not unprofessionalism on our part to like try and exclude every single bias that we carry around with us. We're humans, we're very limited creatures, and researchers are definitely very limited creatures also in time, and so we carry these biases. We develop then systems to help us avoid our biases, and this was the idea of double blind. I said I didn't think that it worked. The thing about I don't think that it would just work, make it all open, and people will be kind of shamed into acting professionally. We've seen from the internet, this is not the way it works. If you see the bun fights that happen on Twitter on a daily basis, and so I especially with the concern for the early career researcher or from less privileged backgrounds in the peer review system, I do think that this is a legitimate concern. I will say, there is not any evidence that this happens. It's a concern everybody has. Spoiler alert, so Sergio and I are just finishing up on a preprint. We've been reviewing all the evidence about open peer review for the last 5 years, and it will be available in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So, there's one study, and it's an agent-based model. It's a theoretical model. There's no study on this. Does this happen or how this happened? But there are also other factors which we should bear in mind, like when we open. I do think we should open, but we need to bear in mind, and especially as it relates to equity, if like at PLOS, you give authors, the reviewers, the option to sign their reviews or not, who signs more? Old white men. And why? Because they feel the status and they feel entitled to have that opinion, and there's a certain performativity to this transparency. But that means that if we're then attaching credit to peer review, then they get more visibility, you know. So yes, I agree with you, Charlotte. This is the world that we should work towards. But I think thinking of the world that we live in, I think we should edge towards it. A lot of experimentation, please, and a lot of data to inform our decision making.
Many thanks, Tony. We need to close answers to these questions because we have several more. And the next is, and I will combine two, perhaps, what is the main obstacle in introducing more openness to peer review, which was partly covered in the previous answers? And also, do you expect a decrease of peer review activity in case it was forced to be public by standard? The commenter says, I would be way more careful about a review if it was public. I would think twice about doing it. What are your thoughts? Any comments? Charlotte, please.
Well, I think I would rather do more peer review if it was open and publicly available, because if people could see the peer reviews that I'm doing, then they could also see that I'm pretty professional in doing peer review. And it would maybe not count as a publication, but almost like kind of a publication, because I could list on my CV that I have peer reviewed this or that article, or I've been peer reviewing this or that application. So if it was open and I could put my name on it, then I would be more inclined to do peer review. Actually, to be honest, I reject doing peer review most of the time because since it's invisible free work that I do, it's easier for me to say no and then spend my time on doing my own publication. So I think I would do more.
Thanks. Kelly, please.
So from my sort of publishing experience background, I can say that on Open Research Europe in particular, we don't see that it's any more difficult to recruit reviewers for reviewing papers where we have an open peer review model. In my previous role, so I was at Frontiers before, where it was like semi-open. There's different definitions of what open peer review is, but there they publish the names of the reviewers, but not the full peer reviews reports. We definitely found it more difficult to recruit reviewers for papers there than where I am here. Obviously, there's lots of other factors associated with this. Are people more likely to review for Open Research Europe because it's the European Commission's platform? Maybe, versus just another journal. I don't know, but yeah, from my experience, we don't see that coming up often as a declination reason for reviewers that we've invited, that I'm not doing this because it's open. 9 times out of 10, it's I'm not doing this because I'm too busy and I don't have time to do this.
Thanks, Kelly. Please, Serge.
I think, and well, basing here again on the paper that Tony also just mentioned, will be out soon. Indeed, collecting the evidence on this seems to give the same image as was suggested by Kelly. Then, as far as we know, it does not cause any delays in people accepting to review. People are equally likely to accept invitations. Neither does it cause delays in them performing their review. But again, that's only as far as the evidence goes, and there is only limited evidence of this. Then commenting on Charlotte's response to this question and connecting it to what Tony mentioned before, I think indeed for several people it will be or it will work, as Charlotte mentioned. If it's visible, if I can get credit for this, I'll be more likely to engage in these practices. While the person asking this question noted that, well, I might be more reluctant to do it when all of it is open. And I think here we clearly see this difference where performativity of the openness comes in, where it might make some people who are after the credit in the game more likely to engage, while others who might be somewhat more insecure about their way of performing review, less experienced in doing review. I think we should be somewhat careful here.
Thank you, Serge. And one last reply from Sylvia, please.
Very briefly, but very connected to what Serge mentioned, because I totally agree with our colleague Charlotte. But in one event that we organized on Diamond Open Access, we indeed had some researchers. We came into open peer review, I don't know why, at some point as well. But there were some hesitations about some of the researchers saying that they would feel less prone to do this kind of open procedures because they would feel less at ease. But that it means a little bit the point that Serge mentioned. Maybe they feel a bit unprepared for it. So maybe that's, again, going back to the point that Charlotte was mentioning about the professionalization of peer review. And maybe they acknowledge the fact that we are heavily relying on a system that is not yet very professionalized. That would be my last point.
Many thanks. As we mentioned already the system, right? Perhaps we should move to our second question today. So, the role of peer review in upcoming reform of research assessment. Peer review is recognized as central for qualitative research evaluation in the recent agreement of research assessment, which is likely to reshape the rules for evaluating research in Europe and beyond. Let me tell you that I literally printed the agreement and was reading it with my pencil and everything like that. And I tried to underline how many times the word peer review appears in the document. I don't remember the exact number, but quite a lot. So it's really like it's in the very core of the upcoming reform. What are your thoughts about that? Sylvia, please.
Thank you, Alexandra. Indeed, so for those that maybe are not so familiar with the process, the reform of research assessment is an initiative that started in 2021 with an ongoing consultation, open consultation by the European Commission to different stakeholders, which led to a scoping report on the need to reform research assessment. And it has led to a work that a group of different stakeholders have been undertaking in the whole 2022. The first part of this work was the agreement that was published on 20th of July, if I'm not mistaken, and that is available now on the new website of the initiative. And indeed, there is this creation of this new initiative is called COARA. It's Coalition Towards Advancing Research Assessment. So you mentioned, Alexandra, very much like reshaping rules. I think we are at the stage where we want to formally recognize the need to talk about this, and not necessarily reshaping things, but understanding that there are defaults in the systems of assessment that we have, and encouraging the dialogue within the different stakeholders that we represent from our side, the university perspective. So within the agreement, peer review indeed is heavily mentioned, and it's really seen as the alternative to the quantitative indicators that are used, and is really pushed into their fostering more qualitative evaluation. Now, what we see, and we've been discussing it before, and this has been not a criticism, but a little bit of a challenge question that all the time all stakeholders have been putting into the agreement process. Well, peer review is not always working very well. We are seeing still some defaults. We see that it has biased, that it's laborious in terms of time, it's very time consuming, and that sometimes indeed the recognition for that process is very limited. Now, we know that eventually many of the peer review processes that we have, especially also in recruitment, and that's why the agreement comes into place, are working, or they have to be based themselves in quantitative indicators to kind of support these decisions that are first done by a peer review. But then if you need to really kind of make a distinction between one or another researcher in terms of a promotion, you tend to rely on these quantitative indicators. So the agreement looks very much into the peer review, but the final process, and those that are reading the agreement in its final version, will see that it's always complemented by a more responsible use of quantitative metrics. I think that's important to take into account, especially for those that are not very familiar with what the process is. There is no shift towards peer review only, because we know that the system will not hold all right being based completely on peer review. From the perspective of universities, there are some issues that our members have been communicating to us with relying heavily on peer review, especially in recruitment and promotions processes. So they see that human resources departments may be subject to criticism of subjectivity. So there's also an issue there on how to convey the value, but also the constructiveness or professionalism of peer review. I think that's important. But then also from the practical perspective as well, the issue of lacking, available reviewers, available experts, that they may be also something. I think it was Tony who mentioned it. Not a bias, but some reviewers would be more prone to go for more prestigious institutions, more prestigious researchers, and that would in any way also have a disadvantage for different profiles of institutions and also academics. And then maybe another question that I would like to bring in, and that's something that we are discussing also internally, we are evaluating too much. So is there also a reconsideration into the systems that we have and the amount of times that we are imposing ourselves to these reviews from the academics, but also from the projects, from the institutions? And maybe this reflection on doing something better, but less often, something of more quality, more time consuming, but less often. So I think these are more or less the key things I would like to leave with the group.
Many thanks, Silvia. Okay, please, Serge.
Thank you, and thank you for this very, very rich question or statement, actually topic that we're discussing now. I think there's so many sides to this, and let me try to restrict myself a bit in answering to that. But first, the role of peer review in upcoming reform of research assessment. That can mean, as we've discussed before a bit, then changing ways of doing research assessment might give credit to different forms of scholarly practices and scholarly outputs, of which performing peer review can be one. And indeed, new ways of research assessment can thereby incentivize people to do actual peer reviews. But also, if we incentivize for other diverse scholarly outputs, like publishing open data, open code, open software, we might also want to tailor peer review formats to those more diverse outputs. Because I still think currently, while we're incentivizing people to publish their data, who has ever done a peer review of some data set? I think there's hardly anyone who's doing that. So if we're trying to incentivize these kinds of things, we might want to have review formats to be tailored to that as well. And then on the other side, of course, when talking about your question or topic, I think the actual role of peer review in this reform of research assessment can be at stake. And Sylvia already mentioned a lot of very interesting aspects here. But what I think is key is that the peer review, in the end, remains a central element in much of what we do. But the very essence of the peer in this, I think, is drastically changing. So who do we still consider to be a peer? Is that, well, because of all kinds of new movement towards transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, opening up of review to wider audiences, wider societies, this really notion of the peer in this whole process, I think, is drastically changing, and we need to be somewhat careful, perhaps, about how we want it to change and how to influence and structure actually that process.
Many thanks, Serge and Veronique. The stage is yours, please.
Thank you. Well, I mean, even though I am European, I've been in the US for a very long time, so I feel like I'm more familiar with the research assessment sort of landscape in North America, and you know, adding to the points that have been raised by Sylvia and Serge, I think it's going to be absolutely critical to think deeply about the guidance that is provided for peer review. I mean, peer review is inherently a subjective activity. And from that perspective, in North America, I would direct you to the work of the Skolcom Lab. Juan Pablo Alperin in Canada and with co-workers have done sort of reviews of what's called review, tenure, and promotion documentation here in North America. And it's appalling. It's entirely publication specific. There is no openness that is being recognized in the guidance, right? And this is just a documentation that is given to people who assess their peers in RPT process. There is no evaluation of sort of public engagement even in universities that have a very strong public mandate and so on. So it's a very the guidance that is provided is very it's not quite fit for purpose if we want really to think about research assessment in a broader way. And then the other part of their work that I find absolutely fascinating, and we've done some research on that as well, is sort of the heuristics that people use in this subjective process to evaluate quality and evaluate. So you really have weird definitions of, you know, there is a lot of focus, for example, on documentation and guidance to reviewers, on impact and prestige and things like that. And then when you ask people, faculty, to describe how what is prestige and what is impact, and the circular definitions that you see, or the fact that you see people who say, well, no, I'm really focused on the credibility and trustworthiness, but I use proxies that are actually proxies of impact, right? And so it's a really complex system. And I think that thinking really, really carefully about how we are implementing it, what guidance is being provided, and being absolutely conscious of the biases that exist in the system is going to be very, very important.
Thanks, Veronique. Tony, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with all this. I think that peer review, it's in danger of being seen as a panacea at the moment. Like this reform to rewards and recognition, it started with DORA, and it started with we hate the impact factor, and it's being used for a purpose that wasn't made for, and that's absolutely right. But we know that peer review is also full of biases. There's this very major assessment exercise in the UK called the Research Excellence Framework, and I know some people who've been examined, and this uses peer review a lot. And they've been examining who benefits compared to the metrics, and they're quite similar, even with peer review. Again, to go back to what Veronique was saying about kind of we have these, as assessors, we have these ideas of impact and prestige and excellence. There are very often principles of homophily which go along with that. Excellence, we know what excellence looks like, we know where it comes from, and this tends to further concentrate resources to the center and to certain demographics, I think. So just peer review is not the panacea. And then the idea of that we need to include peer review into the review criteria. So if I go for promotion, then I should be to incentivize peer review, they should count how many peer reviews I've done and be able to see how many, like how well I've peer reviewed and stuff. So we did a similar exercise to the Scholl-Com Lab thing on over 7 different countries. Peer review is actually mentioned a lot in promotion, review, and tenure. And I worry in the kind of reform of rewards and recognition, how many things we're going to try to stuff in to incentivize. Because we can put a lot of stuff in there, but like what people actually pay attention to, and then how we operationalize it. So we can like say you have to judge them on this criteria, but they still might be judging people on how much money they brought in and what publications they have. So I guess what I would prefer to see in this whole conversation is exactly what Sylvia said, less assessment, please. Like less, like reduce the competition, and definitely don't just make it a brand new basket of metrics that you've got to, with 1 million boxes and hoops that you've got to jump through and show how many open access publications you have and how many data sets you have, because people will only gamify these things. Leave researchers the time and the space to do good research, to let them be process oriented rather than publication oriented. Yeah, next.
Thanks, Tony. Please, Charlotte.
And I jump into this again when the discussion gets very interesting. I very much agree with Tony and Sylvia that we are over assessing all the time. I've been working in a library for 6 years, and you know they never assess the librarians. If you go into a library and ask the librarians to help you do searching for literature, and they fail, nobody does anything about that. I mean, but if you're a researcher, you have to be assessed all the time. And why is that? Why did we lose trust in researchers being professional people who can judge what is good and what is bad themselves? And I don't think I understand how researchers became these prügelknabe for all kinds of assessments. Maybe the system was corrupt somewhere, sometimes a while ago, but with the new generation of researchers, there's no reason to think that they don't know what quality is and can basically assess themselves. And the system, the way it works is like this assessment is like a Russian doll, you know, where you have a doll and a doll and a doll. Because when I publish stuff, then it's peer reviewed before it's published. And then when I'm up for promotion, then the already peer-reviewed journal articles are being peer-reviewed again by a new assessment team. That's crazy. It's waste of money. It's waste of time. It's completely stupid. with regards to the research assessment reform, I have mixed feelings because with the peer review system we have now, I think it's a bit problematic that there's so much focus on the peer review. But I like, on the other hand, that we abandon the irresponsible use of metrics. So I think this again points in the direction of that we have to work more on professionalizing our peer review, to study it more carefully, to understand its effect and to lessen it, because we are absolutely over assessing researchers all the time. It's waste of money and it's waste of talent, because people that receive unconstructive peer review, we know that from Gemma Derrick's study, they opt out of academia and we lose them. It's waste. So we need to professionalize the peer review. That is a very, very crucial thing.
Many thanks, Charlotte. Kelly, please. We cannot hear you, unfortunately.
Sorry, Dougie was snoring, so I like double muted myself just in case. So he finds this whole conversation really dull, so you might hear him. I'm sorry for that, but I don't. Anyway, really interesting points being raised by everyone, and I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. So Serge mentioned about peer review of data, so people being encouraged to share their data openly, upload it as a data set, but what's happening with it? Is anybody citing it? Is anybody reusing it? How are we tracking that? We do have an article type at F1000, and I've seen it now at a few other publishers as well, called a data note, which does allow you to sort of share your data as a more publishable unit and then include more information, which a lot of people are already doing in sort of README files when they upload their data sets, but this is something that can actually be sort of counted a bit easier. And then we do ask for those papers to be peer reviewed as well, to make sure that the method of collection and how it's been shared is kind of appropriate for the type of data that it is. So hopefully that will provide some useful feedback for that, and we'll see that spread to more publishers as well. Secondly, I think, Tony, you mentioned about counting the number of peer review reports that people have submitted and how this could lead to like gamification. I agree. And I think that it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that a lot of the same people are going to be being invited for every single article anyway. So you're going to see more and more of the same names being invited and therefore contributing to peer review. And then the people that aren't getting invited don't have an option to say yes and are therefore then being disadvantaged by that, even though that's entirely not their fault. And that would also disadvantage early career researchers who are going to be less likely to be invited to peer review in the first place, even though they might be some of the most likely people to say yes to do it. And there's some evidence to suggest that they're actually some of the most thorough when they're doing their peer review reports as well. So it could provide really interesting perspectives. I did want to point out that the reform of research assessment, it does mention peer review, as you said, Oleg, explicitly, and that should factor in. It also kind of mentions it indirectly, stating it as a contribution to science and society, and it mentions it in the framework of peer review being a practice that contributes to openness and transparency. So in that sense, closed peer review, is that really contributing to openness and transparency or not? So there's some discussion there as to whether is all peer review good, or is it just open peer review that we're saying you need to be contributing to? And if so, that also limits the field there, but works in ORE's favor. So I'm not going to be too upset about that. What else did I want to say? Oh, I wanted to mention as well, in the agreement, they specifically mention a commitment to resources to provide training for peer review. And I think that was mentioned by a couple of people here as well. And my question to this group really on that is, where should the onus be on who should be providing this training? Should that sit with the publishers, or should it be part of the core sort of PhD doctoral training programs that are implemented across all of universities, or should it sit with organizations like Eurodoc to run these sorts of things in collaboration with publishers, or is it a mixture of all three? And how can we sort of share that more effectively and make those training resources more widely available? I think that's it. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kelly. Actually, we are going to discuss more about the training on peer review in the next question, because we will be speaking about early career researchers and peer review. But yeah, it's very important. So we have several questions, and one of them is, which was partly mentioned already. So the upcoming reform prioritizes peer review, right, and gives control to reviewers, who are people with their, and all of them, people can lie, people can make mistakes, and this can only lead to more biases, right? So, and also peer review works well when strong research culture is in place. But what will be if it's not the case? Sylvia, please.
Difficult question, I take it, but I'm not even sure of what to reply. I think that has been largely mentioned in the discussions of the agreement. And that's why, even though peer review is mentioned, it's not mentioned as the solely mechanism to be based future assessment. So it is really complemented by other indicators, in many cases, quantitative indicators, but used responsibly. So it's more getting this awareness. I think the most important thing of the agreement is to understand that it's a starting point and a basis for having a further dialogue on where we want the research system to go and what's the new role that we see in assessment in that, let's say, future research system. And Tony mentioned it before, and I said, like, it's so true. When did we lose trust in research and our researchers? No, so I think it's important that we recognize that we need to do a reassessment of the values we want to have for research and getting that common understanding. We think that there is a common and an understood definition of what excellence is, what quality is, what impact is, and it's context dependent, sometimes discipline dependent, sometimes team dependent, and institution dependent. And everything is contextualized to these values that we have. Some organizations have gone much farther in the agreement that we are developing at European level than the European landscape itself. And those are colleagues from Norway with the NORCAM of assessment, but then also our colleagues from the Netherlands on the Room for Everyone's Talent and the Dutch initiative on the reform of research of academic assessment. I've been speaking with our colleagues from Maastricht, and one of the first things that they did was to start having this dialogue on what are the core values of our institution. And based on that, what's the kind of professionals and profiles we need? And based on that, getting those profiles and indicators of what they need to look for in the workforce they have or in the workforce they need to look for, you know? And I think that's understanding that will be the first part of the, let's say, of this future process. But we are not there yet. We still think that there is some objectivity and we need to acknowledge that diversity.
Thanks, Sylvia. Please, Tony.
Talking of diversity, because I just talking about these kind of leading examples from the Netherlands and from Norway, Sylvia, not people who research in Netherlands and Norway have really favorable conditions for doing research compared to researchers in a lot of other places. And one thought that I've had for a long time is that so much of our policy is made from the people who sit in these places and see the world through this very narrow slice, and they think they know what's best for everyone. For example, I've had the very great pleasure to work with Alexander in the project Optima, which he excellently coordinates, which is about introducing open science practices to Ukraine. Looking in that context or in other contexts, there are different levels of readiness for open science practices. These countries push along, barrel along the Netherlands. What's next? What's next for open science? Okay, last year was open access. Let's do open data this year. Well, what's on the agenda for next year? And the rest of the world is still catching up to a lot of these things. If we reform research assessment on a model of what is best for researchers sitting in the Netherlands or in Norway or the UK, this might not be best for the rest of the world. And so, just to say on the diversity angle, I really hope that as these initiatives are made, that there are a diversity of voices from across Europe specifically, but globally as well, because as we kind of transform practices here, these have knock-on effects everywhere else, and maybe act to benefit the countries who are leading in the first place.
Many thanks, Tony, especially for the kind words about Optima project. All right, thanks. And we have another question. In the agreement, there is a statement that we should use quantitative indicators in a more responsible way, right? So should we abandon impact factor completely and let's say ASH index, or should we still look at it, but a different angle? What are your thoughts? Please, Charlotte.
You can't abandon it because it's there and a lot of researchers use it and trust it. But what you can do is you can inform researchers about how bad it is for them and how misleading it can be, and that they cannot compare across disciplines. And even within small, limited research areas, you can't compare your H index. One of the foremost professors at my university, she's well famous, so to say, she has an H index of 1, but she has, and in our local publishing company, she has her own pigeonhole because she writes books and people write her letters. So they end up in the pigeonhole. And she's one of the foremost professors, while we have other professors that I never heard about, but I can search them in our databases and I can see they have H indexes of 90. So, I mean, that's really, it's such a misleading figure if you compare it across, but we should inform about that. And that again has to do with professionalizing. I think I said professionalizing many times now, but I really mean it.
Many thanks for your comment. Sylvia, please.
Building very much of what Charlotte has mentioned, but it's indeed about understanding what it means. And here I would bring also another thing that I like to mention, because it has a huge repercussion as well in our institutions and their policies that they promote internally, that is the rankings. Same thing about the rankings, same thing about H index, impact factor. What's their real value? Are we looking behind the data that is collected and the meaning and the results that they are providing? Do we have really a comprehensive picture? So it's maybe being all a bit more responsible about understanding the value that we're giving to these indicators and giving the right value, or the one that they were meant to be. And just as a complement a bit for the question, because I would not like that there's some misunderstanding about the initiative, and maybe a misunderstanding of whether the initiative of reform of research assessment would try to have some models in which it will be based. That's far from the truth. Really, it is really meant to be a space where these initiatives will be able to be shared, but it's not meant in any case to be an harmonized set of assessment that we will try to impose at European level, but precisely understanding the different contexts, disciplines, but also institutions and different types of stakeholders that will need to undertake different types of assessment. So that's the objective. We'll hope if we manage to do it this way.
Thanks, Sylvia. And one last comment from Veronique, please.
Yeah, I just wanted my idealistic self, and I just want to go on the record as a publisher to say, please get rid of the impact factor, because it's the source of so many perverse incentive. My realistic self is actually saying, as Charlotte mentioned, it's here. It's already in the subconscious of people. If you get rid of impact factor tomorrow, people remember the hierarchy of journals that is actually the hierarchy ranked by impact factor, and they substitute journal name for journal impact factor. So I think education about what it means, what these metrics means, what they don't mean, most importantly, is really, really essential.
Thanks, Veronique. And with your reply, we move to our third question, which is somehow connected with that. So our analysis, Eurodoc analysis of the responses of one survey showed that most researchers typically begin peer reviewing after they themselves have published 5 or more research papers. So the question is, how and if researchers at early career stages should be involved in peer review, and from the very beginning, should we introduce a training for them? We start with Sylvia, please.
Thank you, Alexandro. So I think there is no question about early career researchers being involved in the process of peer review, because they are subject to this process in many ways. So let's say they are part of the system. They feel, they suffer sometimes from the system. So it's important that they are also prepared to be able to contribute to that system. Now, I think there it's even better to give the voice to your own community, Alexandro, and understand what are the needs that they would have to perform these activities well, in terms of everything, the systemic structure, their time, their training, what are the things that they will need to do. We feel that there is a need for professionalization, as Charlotte has been mentioning, for more training, for more ethical guidelines. We have been discussing as well that we are not living in a system where everything is ethical, and that sometimes we're just following behaviors that are not ethical. So having that would be very interesting, but we would be happy to hear from our own community, your early researchers community, or what we can do. Kelly was also pointing out already, shall we publishers do it? Shall we universities provide it? I think it should really be a joint effort, and we should make sure that we have the needs of the early career researchers spell out, and that they tell us how we can best support them in this.
Thanks, Silvia. Research.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll try to keep this very short, because I think many very, very interesting and relevant things have already been said. And I would completely echo what Sylvia said. And well, there's really no question about whether early career researchers should be part of peer review, because they are in so many different ways. And then indeed they need to have the resources to do that. So echoing Charlotte's call for professionalization of this process in many different ways. Then just to briefly add to that, and to relate it back to some of the previous discussions we had about the diversity in the different ways of doing peer review, I think their early career researchers tend to be some of the main change agents in getting new ways of doing review more mainstream. Again, reporting from some of the data that Tony and I collected for this paper that will come out soon, it shows that open peer review practices in many different ways and many different elements thereof, it's mostly early career researchers who tend to be very positive about that and willing to at least engage in that. And there might be some concerns, as we've addressed before, but in general, early career researchers tend to be most willing to explore these new ways of doing that. So I think early career researchers are very much inclined in peer review, and they can even be the main agents that help us change review towards more favorable formats.
Thanks, Serge. Veronique, please.
Yeah, I think I would just second the fact that absolutely there is, I mean, I think the question of, I mean, the culture of critique that we have in science is really essential to and this is, it represents itself in the peer review process. So I think that the earlier that early career researchers actually get engaged in that process, the better, really. But completely seconding also the fact that we need sort of coordination of there are resources available out there, but they're not visible to everyone. They're not really coordinated, and I think that it's very important that we provide that, and that we provide the support for that, and that we do it probably in a coordinated way. It's not just the publishers that can do that. It's not just the institutions. It's probably a coordination, but also, you know, mentors and buddies and a whole host and peer groups, right? I mean, you know, there are peer review journal clubs of preprints that are organizing themselves. So there are more and more means of getting engaged, even outside of sort of that formal, you know, publisher managed peer review. And I think that early career researchers should really sort of be aware of these, and we should coordinate across the different stakeholders.
Thanks, Veronique. Please, Tony.
Peer review training, I'm not aware of any compelling evidence that is particularly effective. So by all means experiment with it, but then publish. Because really, I was just Googling, it's a while since I've looked there. There was a kind of trial, randomized trial from 2004 from the British Medical Journal, a very slight effect, slight effect, which had disappeared after 6 months. So yes, early career researchers should be involved in peer review. And yes, it would be a good idea to train them, but make sure that the training is effective and meets kind of the needs that it sets out to solve. Early career researchers already are very often involved in peer review, just in the shadows. Very often, we heard from Charlotte how many peer review requests she gets. I also get a lot, and it makes me feel guilty that I don't say yes, especially. And so what sometimes ends up happening, and sometimes turns out to be quite often in some cases, is that the principal investigator of the lab, who maybe has a pyramid, it's maybe like a pharaoh with a pyramid of postdocs and PhDs under them, they will pass on the review to a postdoc. And the way that this has traditionally worked is the postdoc learns to do the review by doing the review, and then the PI submits the review under their own name. But because the terms are usually you can't show this manuscript or to anybody else, then they can't say, oh, by the way, my postdoc did this. So even if it's just internal, like the editor of that journal never knows that this review, which might be really good, was done by the postdoc rather than the PI. There was kind of an initiative a couple of years ago, which I don't think took off, to kind of get rid of this ghostwriting by encouraging journals to adopt a system where it's kind of like a mentoring system. Like, yes, I agree to review. It will be with my postdoc or PhD, and I will coach them through the system. I think that this is kind of the way that it's been, that a lot of people have learned how to do peer review, and I think that kind of the scaling up of this practice, I think, really should be encouraged. Also, just to say that open peer reviews in and of themselves are a great training material. Just being able to look at the reviews for a journal and just see what the standard, well, not the standards, but kind of the tone and what processes are in place. So this is another advantage to open peer review. Yes, do training materials. Eurodoc do training, but make sure it works.
Thanks, Tony. We will think about it definitely. Please, Charlotte.
One thing that I'm very happy about with my job is that it gets me into contact with young researchers. And every time I get into contact with a new young researcher, I'm so thrilled how skilled they are. They were trained by my generation, but I mean, they have learned from me and from my colleagues, where I've learned from some much older professors that were not half as professional as my generation was. And now we are creating a new generation that is much more professional than we ever were. So, I mean, it would be very stupid not to include the young researchers with all their skills in the research process, in the review process. And I very much agree with Tony that it would be a great initiative to have it in the open, that it's actually a junior researcher doing this with the mentoring of a senior researcher, because then, you know, when I see a peer review report made by a junior, then I can correct it and I can say, well, you should think a little bit about the person in the other end. You could do this in a more constructive way, and I would also edit slightly, and in this way help the young researcher to get rid of the worst box in the peer review process. And whether the training of young researchers, I think absolutely it should be a joint effort. The industry knows a lot about how peer review is done and should be done and could be done, and what happens to publications that get a bad peer review. You know all about that, and you also have, at least some of you, some resources that could help out in this matter. University people like myself have a lot of experience. We could also join in, and there are organizations all over Europe like Euron and like your organization, Alexandra, who could help in this matter. So we should definitely do this as a joint effort. And then finally, because we have this reviewer deficit, we simply don't have enough. So if we exclude the young researchers, the reviewer deficit would be even worse. So I think it's mandatory that we include them, but also that we help them and support them the best we can in the process of learning.
Thanks so much. Now, Kelly, please.
Yeah, so to pick up on the point specifically, you kind of stole my thunder there, Tony. I was going to say exactly that about how early career researchers are definitely doing this activity kind of in the shadows, exactly as you say, and they're not getting any credit for that either, which kind of perpetuates the problems that we just spoke about reform of research assessment as well, if they're ghostwriting it. So F1000 actually does follow this scheme that you were mentioning, and we do allow co-reviewing across, I think, all of our platforms, but definitely on Open Research Europe, and hopefully this can give a little bit of protection to the early career researcher as well, kind of validates the point that they said if they were a bit afraid to say some criticism about that paper. If they've got the backup of their PI who's worked with them on the review, then it's not just them standing there alone. And hopefully if we can try to increase engagement with these open peer review reports in the forms of citing them, or maybe just commenting on the papers as well, to have not only the peer review report from the early career researcher or anyone really, but also like subsequent public commenting review of a paper as well, to back up like, yeah, they're actually right in what they said, I agree with them, or also no, I don't actually agree with them. I think for F1000 we have the different versioning of the articles like I mentioned as well, so it's kind of like a living thing. The more feedback that you can get on something, the more improvement you can put on it in the next term round and the next time someone else tries to do that experiment as well. I think that was kind of all I had to say on the peer review front. I think it's interesting to think about how this, I think someone in the comments said about how we need to, if we rerun this again, should it be sort of part of a standard set of training like Mary Curie do? That's a really interesting angle there. Like if you work with animals in your research, you have to go and redo that training every so often. So why do we not have something that's for such a fundamental skill? Perhaps there's something that we could set up there. But as Serge mentioned, there's so much variety in peer review that I think it's very difficult to come up with like one set of training that is going to work for all the different publishers and all the different even peer reviews that are taking place that separately from publishing as well. So how do we kind of get around that problem, or do we just sort of focus on the core, which should be the same anywhere? When you're looking at a paper, this is what you should be looking for and this is what you should be commenting on. Forget all the technical stuff and the format of the report, that can come later, but that core fundamental of it should be, I hope, relatively standard.
Many thanks, Kelly, and also thank you for picking up the last question on YouTube. Actually, we already have some
Tony
questions.
stole something from me, so I had to steal something from you, right?
Okay. All right. So we have a question from Julia, but as she is here in the call, Julia, could you please perhaps ask it yourself, if possible?
Okay, thank you, Alec. And thanks a lot for this amazing debate and panel. All of you are really giving a lot of information for everybody of us. I was wondering if, since some of you are very expert in the peer review process, do you have any data in the frequency of people that are actually doing peer review in terms of career stage? Because I was reading recently that maybe because of the famous Great Resignation, the researchers after, which has an H index, sorry for that, major of 30, are starting to do much more less peer review than before. Do you know anything about that? Can you explain this kind of tendency, or do you have any kind of data?
No, I don't. It's a great question, though.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also don't have any data. I mean, anecdotally, I can tell you that normally the peer reviews that the reviewers that are recommended by the authors are most often like the top person in this field. I want this person to review the article. And the chances of that person coming back and agreeing to review that are very, very slim. And this is partly why you end up having to invite so many people just to get the 2 reviews for that one paper. Or as Tony said, like if they do accept to review it, is it really them, or have they outsourced this to a member of their team? I really don't know, unfortunately. Yeah.
Have you seen a difference between now after the COVID and before? A difference in the frequency of peer review? Like maybe before people were more active or more proactive on doing that, and if now there is a sort of burnout or too many journals or too many platforms were publishing, that now people are getting confused maybe.
I think I don't know if it's like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Veronique, go ahead.
No, you go, okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I don't know if it's directly linked to COVID or not, but we've definitely seen, like, even the years before COVID as well, this sort of development of this peer review crisis, in which it's becoming more and more difficult to find people to do the reviews. And that's not even to speak about the quality of the reviews that are then ultimately being submitted, because a lot of them we can't see, right? So whether it's connected to COVID or not, I don't know, but people are definitely far less likely to accept to do a review and submit it in a timely fashion than they have been previously, more historically.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Veronique, please.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, we don't have hard data, but I also think that the data we have around COVID is really noisy, right? Because I mean, we saw very different patterns anecdotally. People who, you know, were not able to go to the lab and were actually more willing to contribute in some ways, and doing that during the lockdowns, right? So there were very different types of patterns there. But the other thing that I also want to point out is that I don't think we are using the universe of potential reviewers in the best way possible. And yes, that speaks to early career researchers, but also researchers in different geographic areas and with different expertise. And part of the problem is identifying people and finding them. So being visible and having your expertise being visible is actually a very important thing to get involved in peer review, and it's a very important thing for publishers to identify new reviewers, because I think we're all desperate to get a more diverse pool of reviewers in order to address some biases and stuff in the system.
Thanks, Veronique. Kelly, please.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this and say, you know, Open Research Europe and F1000 generally operate on a model whereby we ask the authors to provide recommendations for people that they think could review their paper. And broadly speaking, people say that this results in very like well-structured and very constructive review, because they know for sure, they have faith that the person that reviewed this knows what they're talking about. And also then the authors can't really dispute what they said because they kind of chose this person. So they obviously trust this person. However, that is perceived sometimes negatively externally, in that they think there's more chance of bias in the reviews that we receive because the authors themselves suggest those people. I mean, we do a number of checks to conduct this, to make sure that that isn't the case, but there is that misconception externally. But I wanted to come back to something that Charlotte mentioned earlier. If we don't have the authors suggest and we move to a more sort of AI generated way of like pulling everyone that's published on this, and then can you suggest some people to me that might be willing to review, you're going to get more and more of that situation that Charlotte explained, where I was a co-author on this paper with this dude for some, you know, really minute part of the work that I did on that, and now I keep getting recommendations for something that is completely outside of my field, which makes the situation worse. I think then researchers are going to be far less likely, or more likely, sorry, to just ignore invites from certain journals because they know, oh, a lot of the time the invites I receive from them are irrelevant. So I'm not sure quite what the answer is, but I don't think either way is 100% correct yet.
Yeah, we are already running out of time, so let me thank you for all amazing comments and the discussion. So I will ask you to make some final comments, but we will start from Charlotte, if possible.
Oh, I wasn't really prepared for that, but my final comment would be, what a nice way to spend the evening meeting guys like you and having such an enlightening and interesting discussion. This has really been fantastic. So I want to thank you, Alexandra, for setting this up. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Charlotte. Please, Sylvia.
Well, I think it's being obvious that there's so many things to work on now. So we should try to see how this doesn't rest only in discussions and getting us pointing out to challenges, but see maybe how we could collaborate in the future and do something together to bring also some recommendations in the future of peer review. Would definitely very happy to contribute to that, and it will be absolutely necessary because we know that the system is far from perfect. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. Serge, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to echo what Charlotte said. This was a great and very inspiring session. Thanks for bringing us together from stakeholders from so many different angles and perspectives. And this was very interesting for me. I learned a lot, and I hope people watching this had the same feeling and experience.
Thanks, Serge. Veronique, please.
Well, I'll just double down and saying thank you for organizing this. I mean, I'm actually feeling quite optimistic of seeing the interest and insight and thoughtfulness that everybody is and these organizations like Eurodoc and your own are bringing to this topic of peer review, and so I think I'm feeling quite optimistic, and thank you for that.
Many thanks, Veronique. Tony, please.
Thanks. A great conversation. Yeah, I don't have anything else to say. Good night.
Thanks, Tony. And again, last but not the least, Kelly.
Yeah, no, thank you, everyone. Really insightful conversation. And as Sylvia said, I think we still have a way to go to sort of optimize peer review as much as we can. And that may not be a standard thing across all countries or disciplines or career stages even. We're yet to see. But I think it's also worth mentioning that when the original peer review system was rolled out, people hated it and they really didn't like it at all. It took a really long time for that to be adopted. So it's unsurprising to me that it still takes time for any subsequent changes to be sort of accepted as the new standard. So yeah.
Dear all, thanks so much for joining us today at this discussion. It was very interesting, and I think I will listen to it once again in a recorded way because many interesting aspects, many different interesting thoughts, and I really believe that and hope that our collaboration will continue, and perhaps we will organize another webinar on some other interesting topic in the future. So thanks again for being with us today, and looking forward to furthering our collaboration and communication. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.